Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Fast Pass, the history podcast in close to 30 minutes or less. As always, I'm Megan.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Trevor.
I went into this episode with the intention, I just want y'all to know, of writing something less heavy because my MO for this podcast has been heavy topics. But the topic I thought would be less heavy ended up being really heavy. So, let's talk MKUltra. MKUltra was the CIA codename used from 1953 to 1963 for a series of top-secret research projects that focused on developing and testing mind control techniques. Yes, mind control. Two other mind control projects came before MKUltra. They were called Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird. Both of these kind of dropped off, but then came back as MK Search, and eventually they all became MKUltra. They all saw the same goal, they just had different methods and names.
So, MKUltra came about because top CIA officials like Richard Helms, Alan Dulles, and Frank Wisner felt afraid that the U.S. was in a race with China and the Soviet Union to master the art of mind control. These fears and mind control worries originally came from a few places. The OSS's Office of Strategic Service search for a truth drug during the 1940s. The OSS wanted to find the mythical drug that would force detainees to tell the truth and spill all their secrets. The Nuremberg doctors' trial, it came out that Nazis had a chemical and biological warfare program, which made the U.S. want to step up their efforts to make advances in that field, which included the recruitment of scientists, technicians, and other specialists from the former Nazi regime under Operation Paperclip. That's another episode. And then, in February of 1949, the CIA became convinced that Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty was brainwashed by the Soviet Union, which caused the creation of Project Artichoke and Bluebird to find out how to use drugs and operational hypnosis. The CIA leaders were convinced that success in the world of intelligence and counterintelligence required, quote, bold men of action who were willing to do whatever it took to protect U.S. national security, end quote.
Then, in 1953, the Korean War was coming to an end, and the New York Times was publishing articles about American POWs returning from war, converted by communist brainwashers. Ooh. Some of the POW GIs were confessing to committing germ warfare, which the U.S. denied, of course, and others were, quote, so brainwashed that they refused to return to U.S. at all. Just a tidbit of history feels relevant for no reason whatsoever. They were also weeks away from secretly sponsoring the overthrow of the democratically elected leader of Iran called Operation Ajax to secure Western oil interests in the region. Anyway, brainwashing became a huge fear throughout the US in the 1950s. Newspaper articles like New Evils Seen in Brainwashing and Brainwashing versus Western Psychiatry that discussed sensational accounts of mind control techniques that nobody could resist. Ooh. And this created an overall sense of paranoia in the U.S. culture. But also, brainwashing was a comforting explanation for why communism took root so quickly. Clearly, nobody could see the validity of communism, so it had to be Soviet brainwashing techniques that they're using on their own people to believe in this quote-unquote backwards ideology.
Alan Dulles became director of the CIA in 1953, and in his opening speech, he brought up what he called, quote, brain warfare. The battle for men's minds, specifically the Soviet Union's battle for the minds. He described the, quote, Soviet brain perversion techniques as effective, but, quote, abhorrent and, quote, nefarious. And he referenced those Korean War POWs who were returning from the U.S., quote, parroting the communist propaganda they heard at the POW camps. This was obviously very scary for the CIA because, clearly, the only reason someone could see the merit in communism after fighting a capitalist war is brainwashing and mind control. Quote, we in the West are somewhat handicapped in brain warfare, he said. Quote, I wonder whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become in Soviet hands. We might call it, in its new form, brain warfare. The target of this warfare is the minds of men both on the collective and on an individual basis. The aim is to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on a free will or rational basis, but rather responds to impulses implanted from outside. If we are to counter this kind of warfare, we must understand the techniques the Soviet Union is adopting to control men's minds. Parrot-like the individuals so conditioned can merely repeat thoughts that have been implanted in their minds by suggestions from the outside. In effect, the brain under these circumstances becomes a phonograph, playing a disc put on its spindle by an outside genius over which it has no control, end quote.
3 days after Alan Dulles gave that speech about mind control, he approved the consolidation of Project Artichoke and Bluebird into the beginning of MKUltra. It was financed completely off the books and without formal contracts. MKUltra's experiments centered around behavioral modifications via electric shock therapy, hypnosis, polygraphs, radiation, drugs, toxins, and chemicals. Sidney Gottlieb, named, quote, the CIA's chief poison maker, a CIA chemist, ran the operation. Quote, Gottlieb wanted to create a way to seize control of people's minds, and he realized it was a two-part process. First, you had to blast away the existing mind. Second, you had to find a way to insert a new mind into the resulting void, end quote. Stephen Kinzer, author of Poisoner-in-Chief, Sidney Gottlieb, and the CIA Searching for Mind Control, explains. And he didn't get to do Part 2 very much, but did a lot of Part 1.
The drug of choice for MKUltra was LSD. It became the drug of choice because the US had gotten reports that the Soviet Union was engaged in, quote, intensive efforts to produce LSD. This made the CIA very interested in it, because if the Soviet Union may be using it and may be brainwashing people, well, we might as well do the same thing. They thought they could be useful in gaining, quote, control of bodies, whether they are willing or not, end quote. Sidney Gottlieb brought LSD to the US for this experiment. Yes, the CIA is the reason we have LSD. In the early 1950s, he arranged for the CIA to buy the world's supply of LSD for $240,000. That's $2.9 million in today's money. But there was a problem with that. Sandoz, the company that made it at the time, only made small batches of LSD. Sandoz agreed to continue to supply the CIA with 100 grams weekly, but that wasn't enough for the scope of the project, so MKUltra entered negotiations with Eli Lilly and Company to synthesize LSD in large quantities. Gottlieb ended up spending $5,000 for project expenses for this company to make the LSD, and another $400,000 for the purchase of Eli Lilly and Company's created LSD.
In November of 1953, 10 scientists got together at a cabin in the forests of Maryland for a retreat to discuss projects away from Washington, including Gottlieb. The second night there, all but 2 men had their drinks secretly spiked with LSD. Gottlieb then asked them about their experience, especially their changed mental state. Most of the men got through it without any side effects, but Dr. Frank Olson had a really bad trip. In the following days, he was erratic and paranoid. It was getting noticed, which Gottlieb did not want, so Gottlieb tried to get Olson psychiatric help while covering up what had happened. But that ended in disaster because Olson jumped out of a window at a hotel in New York City and fell 10 floors to his death. There were no repercussions for Gottlieb's actions and part in his mental decline that led to his death.
Even though this incident happened with this small group of scientists, Gottlieb still gave LSD to hospitals, clinics, prisons, and other institutions, asking them, through fake foundations, to carry out a research project on what LSD was and how it might be used as a tool for mind control. Imagine being a Stanford professor and getting that email. The CIA hoped they could use LSD to not only break their mind, but influence someone to assassinate enemy leaders. The test subjects were a mix of people who volunteered under coercion, and people who had no idea they were involved in the program. People who did not consent to being tested on. They ranged from boys with learning disabilities at Fernald School to American soldiers, prisoners, and state hospital patients. They often preyed on the most vulnerable members of society, especially prisoners, who were promised extra recreation time or commuted sentences for participating, and those prisoners would be given, quote, unfathomably large doses of LSD. Some people who volunteered liked LSD. They even told their friends about it. One person was Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So did Robert Hunter, lyricist for the Grateful Dead, and Allen Ginsberg, a poet who talked about the value of LSD. And I think there's an irony in the fact this drug that they thought would control humanity became one of the key parts of the counterculture movement.
One example of an MKUltra test subject who had a horrible experience was Whitey Bulger, a former organized crime boss. He was one of the prisoners who volunteered for what he thought was an experiment for finding the cure to schizophrenia. Also, an aside, but how can we call him a consenting person? We had no idea what this trial was for. Anyway, he was tested on in 1957 in the Atlanta penitentiary where he was serving time. He said of the experience, There were, quote, 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, total loss of appetite, hallucinations, the room was changing shape, hours of paranoia, and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares, even blood coming out of the walls, guys turning into skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane, he said. I was in prison for committing crimes, but they committed a greater crime on me.
The CIA knew that if the public learned that they were dosing non-consenting citizens, that it would be horrible PR, so they kept it under wraps. In 1957, the Inspector General of the CIA said, quote, "The knowledge that the agency is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishments of its mission," end quote. It's also important to mention here that MKUltra was a continuation of the work that began in Japanese and Nazi concentration camps, because of course it was. We mentioned Nazis earlier, so the CIA actually hired the dissectioners and torturers who worked in Japan and Nazi concentration camps to come to the US and explain their findings so scientists could build on their research. For example, Nazi doctors had conducted extensive experiments with mescaline in Dachau concentration camp, and the CIA wanted to know if mescaline was the key to mind control, so they hired that Nazi doctor to advise them. Nazis also gave information on poisons like sarin gas, which was still being used. Nazi doctors came to Fort Detrick in Maryland, the center of the MKUltra project, to give a lecture to the CIA officers and tell them how long it took for someone to die of sarin gas. Insane stuff.
Then we have to discuss what was happening at CIA detention centers outside of the United States. Gottlieb used detention centers in Japan, Germany, the Philippines, and more because they were technically not U.S. territories, and therefore it was a legal gray area. CIA officers in Europe and Asia would capture enemy agents or anyone they deemed, quote, expendable, throw them into cells and test all kinds of things on them, not just drugs. They would use electroshock, extreme temperatures, sensory isolation, while asking them questions, seeing if they could break their resistance and their ego. Most of these types of torture were also used in Japanese Unit 731, but that again, episode for another day. How could this happen, you must be asking? Gottlieb was supervised. He was in the CIA. Clearly he had to report to someone. He did. Richard Helms and Alan Dulles. But they didn't want to know what he was doing. So he had carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. People even died because of him, and nobody cared. Because the potential of mind control mattered more.
So there was an operation within MKUltra called Operation Midnight Climax that we need to talk about. And yes, what you're thinking is kind of right. In 1955, on 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco, the CIA built a trap, a bedroom. They hired a UC Berkeley engineer to install bugs and a two-way mirror. Then, George White, who had a career in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, sat behind the two-way mirror and watched as prostitutes lured unsuspecting men into the bedroom where they were dosed with LSD. He watched as these men tripped out, and while it started as just LSD trips, White became too interested in the sex portion of the operation. He looked into how to work with prostitutes, how they could be trained, and how they would handle state secrets. The agents also analyzed when information would be best extracted from a source during a sexual encounter, and found it was immediately after sex. But, disgustingly, it was discovered that his actions were driven by voyeurism, or getting pleasure from watching other people have sex. Quote, "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" Gross.
And just one last point about Sidney Gottlieb here. He was part of another drug experiment and, quote, special interrogation program that left hundreds of people psychologically damaged and others, quote, permanently shattered. MKUltra lasted until 1963 and had 149 sub-projects, some of which were funded until 1966, like Operation Midnight Climax. So 10 long years of kidnapping and dosing random people. It was carried out at well-regarded universities like Cornell, Georgetown, Rutgers, Illinois, and Oklahoma, as well as Emory University, where the chairman of the Department of Pharmacology directed 4 sub-projects. Those experiments by the Emory chairman left many of his subjects, including prisoners at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and a juvenile detention facility in Bordentown, New Jersey, scarred for life. Other sub-projects were established through grants from fake foundations that were actually the CIA. One called the Gesheker Fund for Medical Research, run by a professor of pathology at Georgetown University, allowed the CIA access to a medical safe house at Georgetown and the patients and students who were used as test subjects for MKUltra, in exchange for millions of dollars, of course.
Another, quote, foundation the CIA founded was the Human Ecology Society, which was run by Cornell Medical Center neurologist Dr. Harold Wolff, quote, who wrote an early study of communist brainwashing techniques for Alan Dulles and later partnered with the CIA to develop a combination of drugs and sensory deprivation that could be used to erase the human mind, end quote. There were extreme projects funded through this group, but the infamous one was the, quote, depattering experiments conducted at a psychiatric hospital at McGill University in Canada. The method combined induced sleep, electroshocks, and, quote, psychic driving, where drugged subjects were psychologically tortured for weeks or months in an effort to reprogram their mind.
It came to an end when John Vance, a member of the CIA Inspector General staff, found that they weren't getting consent from everyone. And while the audit board tried to convince the CIA that things should continue, the Inspector General insisted that they follow new research ethic guidelines and stop all research on non-consenting volunteers.
MKUltra really came to an end in 1973 when Richard Helms was removed as director of the CIA by Richard Nixon. Gottlieb left soon after. Since Helms was one of the only people at the CIA who knew the extent of what Gottlieb was doing, as they were leaving, they agreed to destroy all the MKUltra records. Gottlieb himself drove out to a record center and ordered the archives to destroy boxes of records connected to MKUltra. Lucky for us, some records were found in other places, so some remained. Enough to give us clues to what he did, but the scope we'll never truly know.
In 1977, there was a congressional hearing investigating the effects of MKUltra and brought ex-CIA employees in for questioning. The hearings unveiled disturbing details, especially around the suicide of Dr. Frank Olson. Throughout the hearings, staffers claimed they, quote, couldn't remember things about the human experiment, or the number of people involved even. And they would have looked at the records, but in 1973, workers were told, quote, it would be a good idea if the MKUltra files were destroyed, end quote. They said it was because of, quote, privacy concerns and embarrassment. But it was clearly because of the illegality of the entire operation. Quote, we don't know how many people died, but a number did, and many lives were permanently destroyed, end quote.
After the program got shut down, Gottlieb went on to lead a CIA program that created poisons and high-tech gadgets for spies to use. And the rest is history. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Sorry again, it wasn't the fun one I expected it to be. Please stay tuned next week for the After the Pod, where we are going into all of this stuff. Sources are listed in the description box below. And until next time, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.